Welcome back or welcome for the first time, depending on if you've joined me before for these webinars. Today's webinar topic is about processed foods, ultra-processed foods. And so the title, of course, is Are Ultra-Processed Foods Sabotaging Your Health? I think we know the general blanket answer, but there's a little bit of nuance, so I'm happy to cover that. And of course, if you have any questions or concerns during or of course at the end of this presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom left of the screen, where you can also choose to be anonymous if you would like. Just select that option. And if your name's listed, chances are I'll mention your name just so you know that I'm addressing your question. So without further ado, let's get started. So what we'll cover today: first, we will define what ultra-processed foods are, or we'll attempt to define, and you'll see more on this in a second. Also, the general health effects that you can expect or what they seem to be associated with, and what to look out for on food labels so that you can pick the healthiest option. Because I think we all can acknowledge that eating ultra-processed foods aren't exactly escapable completely. I think those are going to be involved in our diets from time to time if we need to. And so I want to make sure that we can at least seek out the healthiest options when those are our options. So, what is an ultra-processed food? To the surprise of many people, including myself, there is no officially established definition. I think many of us can say, oh, I'll know it when I see it, because it's fairly obvious to many of us, but there is truly no established definition, and it does mean different things to different people. So generally speaking, all foods have a level of processing before eating. So if you want to get pedantic about it, yes, even washing and cooking your foods, that does get defined as processing. Anything that is altering the food from its original state is a form of processing. But I think we know that that is not what we're talking about when it comes to processed foods. But there are actually suggested levels to processing, and there are at least 6 classification frameworks or systems to try and narrow down what this definition is so that we can have clearly defined limits, if you will, on what counts and what doesn't. So then when we're talking about highly or ultra processed foods, for most people, it sort of comes down to this industrial made, there's many steps involved in creating it, and normally they are adding lower cost ingredients to the food. So they're adding ingredients that weren't in the food originally. And of course, for the food companies, in an effort to save money, they're going to pick lower cost ingredients, and we can see that many times. And the ingredients are also added for palatability and profitability, like I mentioned, for those companies, and longevity of the product. So in terms of preservation and making sure it can last a while. And also convenience, if we're being honest, convenience for us as well. And affordability is also a way that we can look at it too. Some people want something that's going to cost less for them to purchase at the grocery store. But generally, they are believed to be of lower nutritional quality. And I think that's how a lot of us think about processed foods when we say that out loud. It's like, oh, it's a processed food, it's junk, if you will. And so in an attempt to define it, there is one classification system called the NOVA classification system. It was developed by researchers at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and is actually one of the most widely used to classify foods by level of processing. It comes in levels 1 through 4. 1, of course, is the least processed. 4 is considered the most processed by their form of definitions. And of course, on the right-hand side of this screen here, you can see the levels and their basic definitions. So the unprocessed, minimally processed foods, such as vegetables, fruit, grains, etc. Then processed culinary ingredients, which is where we're looking at plant oils, animal fats. You're making butter, that's going to be counting more or less at a level 2. And then processed foods, where we've got canned vegetables, there's the beer, cider, and typically there's an addition of the oil, salt, or sugar there. And then they move down to ultra-processed foods, such as sweetened beverages, packaged snacks, frozen meals, all of those. And it says, of course, processing includes extraction, chemical modification, very few intact group 1 foods, so less recognizable from the group 1 here. Now, this list is pretty short, and I did encounter a more comprehensive list, which I have the link here. It's with ECU physicians, and at the end of this presentation, I'm sure we'll have enough time, I will show that. And of course, if you're interested in the list, I've downloaded it as a PDF and be happy to share that with anybody who would like to have it. Now, this classification system is helpful. Like I said, people use it when we are trying to identify foods, but also it is used a lot in research. So when we're trying to research the effects of processed foods on our health, researchers will typically use this classification system as a benchmark. But some of the criticisms that come with this is that even researchers will miscategorize foods. They might put a one that would go in category 3 into a 4, or a one that's in a 3 maybe into a 1. They'll miscategorize it in one way or another. And also some level 4 foods can still be healthy. So a very good example is commercially made hummus. That counts as an ultra processed food according to this definition. But I think we can all agree that hummus is far healthier choice than other commercially made products. And protein powders. We're all familiar with protein powders, especially if we're on weight loss medicines. You may be using one yourself, and that's generally a necessary thing, but it is certainly considered an ultra processed food, but it has its place. And I think we can agree that that is going to be a healthier choice than, say, the ultra processed food that you might buy at a convenience store that's a baked good or something like that. Now, speaking of research, talking about processed foods in our health, there was a landmark study done not too long ago that was published in 2019 that is pretty impressive, in my opinion, in how they were able to do this. They did some research on how processed foods affect our health, and they did use the NOVA classification system. And so, of course, in their article, they were talking about how processed foods are typically high in calories, salt, sugar, and fat. And there seems to be a risk of overconsumption of calories and, of course, subsequent weight gain. And this risk of overconsumption, they theorize maybe, or hypothesize maybe it has to do with that palatability, that additional craving, but we're still working on finding out what's going on there. So this study involved 20 participants, and they followed 14 days with an unprocessed diet, as well as 14 days with an ultra-processed diet, which I've also called UPF just for the shortening here. And they were allowed to eat as much or as little as they wished. And as you can see with this chart here, on the ultra-processed diet, they were eating up to 500 more calories per day. And these calories were coming from carbohydrates and fat, but interestingly, not protein. That basically stayed steady. And also with this ultra-processed diet, they noticed some weight gain in 14 days' time. So you can see here it was almost a gain. They do by kilograms here, but essentially a weight gain of 1 kilo or 2.2 pounds, which in 14 days can seem kind of shocking. That being said, that is one of the limitations of this study. It is a short time frame. It's only 14 days. Is this how the dietary pattern will continue? Will we be constantly eating 500 more calories if we stay on it? And that's something that remains to be seen. But of course, this is a very challenging type of study to lead, since these 20 people had to agree to eat exactly what they were given in this amount of time. And that's a big ask for a lot of people. But I think this is a wonderful example of what we can see, how much more we're eating and what we could potentially see with weight gain. And what about some other health effects of processed foods. So we've seen associations. A lot of other studies that involve how processed foods affect our health have a lot to do with, are we seeing correlations? Are we seeing associations? And many times we're seeing associations with metabolic syndrome, a decrease in kidney health, depression, acceleration in biological aging, cardiovascular disease. Our gut health might get off a little bit, and generalized inflammation in the body, and even more. And these are still things that need to be studied in more in depth just to see what exactly is affecting us. But these are the associations we're seeing. And I do recall reading when I was studying up on this some more that while we were seeing associations with these poor health effects, there were no associations seen with positive health effects from eating ultra-processed foods. And as I touched on just slightly in the previous slide, do we know why though? What's going on here that's affecting our health? Why is it affecting our health? And the complete honest answer is we're not 100% sure. Seems to be that there's many aspects to it that could be affecting us. And of course, there's many components in processed foods. We have the additives, the preservatives, artificial sweeteners, refined ingredients. And so is it the degree of processing, the lack of nutrients? Is it a specific ingredient? And it's very difficult to do studies that can narrow it down that specifically, because you would have to have a very controlled environment with people eating a controlled diet and not deviating. And again, it's hard to do, but research is ongoing. I even saw a call for some volunteers for a similar study pretty recently. So they haven't done it yet, but that's on the horizon for them to go and research this a bit more into how these ultra-processed foods are affecting health. So, like I said a bit earlier, eating processed foods is a bit inevitable just because of it's a fact of life. We're busy people. And so, of course, I support always eating whole, real foods as much as possible. But let's talk about also trying to pick the healthiest options when we are utilizing processed foods in our day-to-day life. So of course, a phrase that I use a lot is that the closest you can get to the animal or the plant, generally that's better. So if you can identify the foods that you're eating, if you're knowing where it's coming from, that's going to be better serving. And of course, if you look for minimal ingredients on your food labels, that will also be a bit more reassuring. The fewer ingredients, the lower the likelihood that there is going to be unnecessary ingredients in there. And of course, try to limit the convenience or snack foods. So if you're at a grocery store, one very common tip is try to shop on the perimeter and limit the time you spend in the aisles, because the aisles is where you're going to find more processed foods. And of course, the snack foods is where you can see quite a bit of processing. And then try and limit the added sugars. We've talked about looking at the food label to avoid too many added sugars. Try and avoid excess sodium. And if you can, try and avoid excess fat. And I did give a list at the bottom here with some added sugar names, because you might see different terms used when we're talking about added sugars. Words like agave, high fructose corn syrup, maltose, rice syrup, evaporated cane juice, and fruit juice concentrates, those all are still considered added sugars. So I was going to make a quiz about this, but in the interest of time, I will just talk about this in general, but I would love for you to think about which one you would pick as well. So we're going to, oh, I just saw a question pop up. See if, oh, Renuka, are Oikos 20-gram yogurts considered processed? Similarly, Fairlife protein shakes. So I will answer this right now because we're transitioning into processed foods, looking at labels. So thank you so much for the question. So to answer your question, yes, those are considered processed foods. The yogurt, if it's not flavored, it might be considered a level 3, but again, I'm certainly not perfect in designating those. but yogurts can sometimes be considered processed when there's anything added to it. And then the Fairlife protein shakes are also considered processed, even ultra processed, because they will do sort of an ultra filtration to try and bring up that protein content. But you bring up two excellent examples, because those are two very healthy foods too. It'd be very hard for me to say that yogurt is a bad choice, or even those Fairlife protein drinks. I think those are an excellent resource, an excellent tool to use when we're trying to drink our protein, get some protein from somewhere other than having to sit down and eat a full meal. And so I think those are the sort of the exceptions where you can say, okay, yes, it's ultra processed, but it's not something that, there's still a nutritional benefit from it, right? You're still getting the benefit of the protein versus, say, the first thing I'm thinking of, because there are some cookies that somebody brought recently, cookies that you might buy in the store. Those are not really going to be that healthy. You could look at that and say, this is definitely going to be a worse choice than if you're going to be picking out either the Fairlife protein drink or the Oikos yogurts. So it's a great question, because that's exactly sort of the angle I was wanting people to think, is that, yes, something's processed. Does that mean it's bad? So those are the healthier options that I would suggest picking. Absolutely. And you're very welcome. I'm so glad to answer that for you. That's perfect question. Perfect. Because that's where I think a lot of us get confused. So you're very welcome. In that same mindset here, let's compare some dips. So say you want a snack and you want to eat something crunchy and you want to sort of scratch that itch. Well, some very common dips are, this is a food label of Sabra hummus here on the left. The middle is Nutella. And then on the far right is Jif to go. And I couldn't find a great food label, so I'm sorry if this is blurry, and I can read some of this out for you if need be. But to start with, I think many of us already know which one comes in third place. And that, of course, would be the Nutella. It's delicious. But one, I know that if you're going to be eating Nutella, as tasty as it is, probably you're not going to be eating it with a side of carrots. And if you look here at the food label, you can see that the sugars are 21 grams. It is also the first ingredient on the food label. Palm oil is an oil that is a saturated fat, so it can help keep it solid like that. Now you've got hazelnuts, that's not a bad thing. Skim milk, also not a bad thing, or cocoa. Soy lecithin, just so everyone knows, emulsifier, that's something that helps keep two things that might not normally mix together to form an emulsion. So it basically keeps the Nutella from separating from itself. And you've got an artificial flavor. So the first thing that stands out, of course, is the sugar content. You've got 21 grams here and 11 grams of total fat, with 4 grams being saturated fat. That's coming from that palm oil there. So not an ideal choice. You're not getting much protein at all. But this is also a good way to compare these other two, because we can see that some of what this has going on is either similar or maybe better or worse. So first, let's move to the Sabra hummus here. Very reasonably short list of ingredients. You've got chickpeas, tahini, so ground sesame, soybean oil, garlic, salt, citric acid, some things to help with preservation. Again, this is commercially made, not at home. And low calories with 2 tablespoons. Fat, we're talking about saturated fat, much lower. Sodium is reasonable, not considered high sodium. Carbohydrates quite low. There's no sugars really, no added sugars. Protein though, of course, we know chickpeas are high protein. 2 tablespoons isn't a whole lot though. So it's not a particularly high protein food, but I would still say far and away much healthier than the Nutella. Moving on to the peanut butter, we can say, okay, we've got definitely the highest calories out of the group here. and the total fat is high, and the saturated fat comes as higher than the saturated fat from the Nutella. However, we can see that the dietary fiber is excellent. It's the highest out of these. Of course, it is a bit bigger of a serving than the hummus over here. But we've got dietary fiber at 3 grams, total sugars 4, but only 3 of those sugars are added. And the protein is at 9 grams in a 1.5 ounce cup. So when we look at that, if you're going for something that's high protein and you want to put it with, say, celery sticks or with an apple, for example, I had Jif to go and an apple just a little bit earlier today. And so are the calories a bit higher? Yes, I'm getting protein though. I'm combining it with an apple. We're getting in the fiber and the first ingredient, roasted peanuts. There is sugar and or molasses, of course. And there is some, oh, I should mention here, fully hydrogenated vegetable oil does not mean trans fats because it is fully hydrogenated, not partially. But I did want to mention that. So they're basically making a saturated fat out of these seed oils here. So it's still something to think about. Mono and diglyceride is also a type of fat here, and some salt. Again, short list. So if you were looking for something that had some protein to combine with a fruit, this is a great choice. The Sabra, though, the hummus here, also a great choice. Say you wanted some carrots. You're getting still quite a bit of health benefits. And if we're all being honest, I don't know how many people would eat only 2 tablespoons of hummus if you like it. So really, these two, they sort of come out even. It depends on what you're trying to get out of that snack. Doing one more comparison here, and we're going to compare protein powders. So we already talked about some protein foods just a little bit ago, which was great. And so again, a great segue here. We're going to look at these protein powders. So we've got the Intech Evolution post-workout protein powder. It's considered a recovery drink, if you will. The Optimum Nutrition Whey protein, and then Orgain for an organic and also, I believe, vegan option here. Check myself just to make sure it is plant-based. Okay, I just wanted to double check here. At the minimum, we've got vegetarian going on. I just want to make sure. So this one is, again, one of these, the Optimum Nutrition versus the Orgain. This one really comes down to what are you looking for in your protein powders? If you want plant-based, then Orgain is the way to go between these two. Absolutely. You're getting in 21 grams of protein. There's no added sugars. You've got 4 grams of fiber, which definitely beats out the Optimum Nutrition Whey. And yes, there's a little bit of fat, but nothing that I would be concerned about. Sodium content is a bit higher, which is worth noting if that's something that is a concern for you. But we're looking at these ingredients, and while the ingredient list is long, it's nothing that really would be where you have trouble, I suppose, identifying certain things. And of course, there are a few items in here where you might say, well, what's going on there? And that's where I could hopefully answer the questions or at least look into it to find out. Xanthan gum is often used for texture purposes in case, and thickening options, just so you're aware. And the same with guar gum. Moving over to the Optimum Nutrition Whey, this one is also, the list you could say is long-ish. You know, they've got a couple artificial sweeteners. So just so you're aware, those are in that product. This one, of course, has stevia. I should have mentioned that in the Orgain. You've got the whey protein isolate and the concentrate. That already makes it highly processed just because you're going from a dairy product to a powder. And they're giving you all the versions. You've got the isolate, concentrate, and the hydrolysate here of that whey. Some natural artificial flavor, some lecithin for emulsifying purposes, and then the gums here for texture. So yes, still highly processed, but you can look here. The sodium content's not too high. Fat content's definitely not high. It's getting in plenty of protein, so a reasonable choice. Now, I've waxed poetic on this. moving on to this post-workout. So there's a lot more going on here. And in fact, the ingredient list is a bit shorter than the other two, which might make you think, well, this has to be, well, I suppose the ingredients other than these types of vitamins and minerals, but it doesn't seem too terribly long. However, even though I do believe carbohydrates are important for recovery, post-workout carbohydrates and protein combination, I think this would be maybe for an endurance athlete, but for most of us, I do think that this level of carbohydrates, 24 grams of sugars, is a bit excessive. We're already looking at 208 calories after exercise, 24 grams coming from sugar. They do say unrefined, but I think personally and professionally, I think that's a bit of a technicality that they're going on there. And protein, 22 grams, so still similar level, but this is one where I would say, again, unless you're working out very, very heavily or doing some endurance activity, this would probably not be the ideal choice. So putting it together, there is no strict definition of ultra-processed foods, but we do have some classification systems to help identify them. None of them are perfect, but at least we're trying to put that together. In general, though, we know that the processed foods that we need to be cautious about tend to be high in calories, sugar, salt, and fat, and they are associated with overeating and various other health concerns. But because of the convenience, because of the affordability, many of us are still going to want or need to choose these occasionally. So it's very important that we have the skills and abilities to identify the healthiest options. Or, since the next slide is for questions, if you ever have questions about identifying the healthiest options, you can always reach out, always to the Premier Weight Loss team, and they can ask me if they don't have the answer, but they can make sure to get those questions over to me whenever necessary. So that being said, I will open this up for any additional questions that you may have. Feel free to enter them. I will also stop sharing the screen so I can share the classification system in case that is an item you might want to have. So let's see if I can share the appropriate screen, while if you have questions, you can type those up in the meantime. Let's see if I can make this cooperate. Oh, Jane, have I heard of the Yucca app or Yucca? I actually don't know how they want it to be called. And let's see. Oh, good. So I did share the proper screen. So I'll touch on that after I answer your question. So funny enough, as I was making this slideshow, was the first time I'd heard of it. So yes, I just heard of it. I downloaded the app over the weekend even just to play around with it. And my opinions are mixed. So first of all, if you find it helpful, then I think that's a great thing to do, to utilize. I think that it can sometimes be a bit unfair in how it categorizes foods. It automatically will give a 10% preference bump when it's assigning its rankings to anything organic. And that's not saying that I have a problem with organic foods, but just because something gets labeled organic doesn't mean that it's automatically healthier. So organic cookies are still cookies, right? And so that's always something to keep in mind. But I do appreciate the fact that they do list healthier alternatives of the food that you're looking at. Yes, most of them will probably be listed as organic, but you're looking at foods that are still fitting the bill of what you were interested in. I am someone who never wants to say that food good, food bad. I try and find a way to work with foods, but yes, I have heard of the app. It's interesting. I don't fully agree with its ranking systems, but I also appreciate the fact that they have a pretty user-friendly system, and that at least if they're saying that they don't like a food, they're giving you options that, for the most part, from what I could see, are very healthy options. So they're not sending you something that presumably they're not getting, as far as I could understand, they're not accepting any payments to promote a certain product over another. So I also appreciate that. If you like it, I would love to know. And if you found it helpful, I think that's great. Absolutely. And you're very welcome, Jane. Thank you for asking. It's always so neat when I hear about people who have heard about these types of apps. And for here, so this was the NOVA food classification system that the ECU physicians that I had mentioned earlier did. They have group 1 all the way through 4, and they give examples of what these foods are. And so they define it very intensively. They go through the group 2, give examples of it, and they give their golden rule here: always prefer natural or minimally processed foods and freshly made dishes. And then they move on to groups 3, groups 4. And so I do like the fact that this is a bit more comprehensive. And so if this is something that you're interested in and you want to have a copy of it, I'm happy to send it, or you can certainly go to their website, the ECU physicians, and download it as well. But I wanted to at least let you know what we had here and what somebody had created. I thought that was a great example. And let's see here, stop sharing the screen. And that was all I had for the day. I think everyone had excellent questions today, very topical and very practical as well. These are questions and concerns that we encounter. The apps, the protein foods, all of those things are super important to look out at. And clearly, I can tell that you have been looking, paying attention, and asking, possibly before this this webinar, what do I do with this, or what does this mean? So I really appreciate that. And I hope this sheds some light on what to look for and this topic in general. But other than that, I had, if nobody else has any questions, or if you want to ask later at the Premier Weight Loss, always feel free to contact them. They'll get in touch with me. But I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the day. And if there's anything I can do at any time, feel free to reach out and let me or them at Premier know. Thanks so much. Bye.